behalf of the Raza Foundation, we welcome you this evening to the second part of the Raza Lecture being delivered by Professor Akeel Bilgrami. There will be two parts to the lecture today. One will be his speaking and finishing his lecture. And then there are two discussants. Kalpana Kannabiran, is that the and Alok Rai. They will be discussing with him, perhaps, in lecture. And then it will be open to you to say something if you want to, or to ask something if you feel so compelled. Thank you very much for coming, and may I request Akeel Bhai to take off.
Okay, so I'll return to some of the points and issues I raised in my last lecture a little later in this one, but I want to pose the topic of today's lecture by pointing out a very striking yet completely undeniable feature of scientific inquiry. And I raise this feature only because it's with scientific inquiry that humanistic inquiry is usually contrasted along the lines that I briefly mentioned last time, which is that humanistic inquiry, that is to say inquiry about the study, inquiry into the nature of societies, and inquiry in the form of analysis and criticism of literature and art, are so suffused with normative and evaluative considerations, norms and values, that talk of truth, on the face of it, according to many theoretical doctrines, is not suitably applied, the concept of truth, to these areas, whereas it is suitably applied to the propositions of natural science. That's a very standard understanding. And I want to so the reason why I'm starting with this feature of natural sciences is in order to try and undermine that way of thinking. And so the feature is this. From the point of view of natural scientific inquiry, one cannot have regret if something one believes turns out to be false and is replaced by some other belief. I'll repeat that. From the point of view of natural scientific inquiry, one cannot have regret if something one had believed turns out to be false and is replaced by another belief. Now, I can hear the protests. Of course I can. I can regret that I've said something false or believed something false. Or I can... Here's a very interesting example that a very elderly person once told me. She said, I really regret that my belief that the earth was flat turned out to be false, because I felt more cosmically at home when I thought the world was flat, that the earth was flat. I just felt safer and more cosmically at home. And I thought that was a very fascinating thing to say. But it doesn't it isn't a counterexample to my point, which is you cannot feel regret. From the point of view of natural scientific inquiry, you cannot feel regret. Regrets of this kind, if there's something false. So why do I insist on this despite having told you of two kinds of regrets? And the answer is, people are not paying attention to what I'm saying. I'm saying from the point of view of natural scientific inquiry, I can't have these regrets. So from the point of view of natural scientific inquiry, I can only applaud the fact that I've come to have a new belief, which is true, rather than and detected something false. So you were missing the point if you say, yes, I can feel regret. You're just missing the point. It's almost tautological, what I'm saying. So it can't be false. From the point of view of such inquiry, it can't be a matter of regret. Now, the reason why I say this is not because it's so obviously true, and it would be misunderstanding to think that it's false and that there are regrets. But I'm not just saying it for that reason. I'm saying it because what I want to do is put science in its place. That is, when I say from the point of view of natural scientific inquiry, I can't feel regrets when something. Another way of saying it is, that point of view is just a very narrow part of life. We have an enormously large number of a large set of points of view on the world. Many points of view on the world. There are natural sciences of inquiry is a very, very narrow point of view on the world. We abstract away from all the multiple rich angles we have on the world and take up this project of explanation, prediction, and so on and so forth. So I only start this way to say something which cannot be denied without being misunderstood. Only, not just to point to an obvious truth, but to put science in its place. That it is a narrow angle on the world, we have many other angles on the world, and all those regrets are from those other angles we have on the world. Do you see the point? All these regrets are there because we have so many different, we want comfort zones. We want to feel safe. Right? We want to feel proud and not shown to be refuted and false. That's why we have those regrets. But those are different angles on the world we have. So science abstracts away from all the rich angles we have in the world, and it does its very narrow kind of inquiry of explaining and predicting and so on. Okay, so now what I'd like to do is to say what the relationship exactly is between these richer points of view on the world from which we feel all these regrets and what we do when we take a much narrower angle on the world which is disinterested, not susceptible to regrets, and it's disinterested inquiry, right? Detached, disengaged inquiry. That's at least the ideal of natural science. We don't always live up to it. If Thomas Kuhn is right, it is more often preached as an ideal than it is lived up to. But nevertheless, when science is exemplary, it is disinterested in that way. Now, if that is so, I want to explore a little bit what is the relationship between these rich angles on the world and natural science. And I want to argue that the richer points of view are more basic and more prior, and they make possible the natural scientific point of view of the world. You couldn't have natural science, you couldn't have what philosophers call logos, which is knowledges of that kind. You couldn't have, I've argued in my last book, you couldn't have the concept of law, you couldn't have the concept of moral principles, you couldn't have political institutions and so on and so forth without a whole background. And that's what I was trying to point out when I gave the example of Wittgenstein last time and the signpost. So I'll put up that diagram again, just so that I can make an appeal to it for things I want to say. So, as I said, Wittgenstein asks, how is it that you and I, in our society, see this, and we don't just see a physical board on the road with a sign, a physical set of marks on it. We see meaning. We see normative directedness. We see a norm saying turn left. We just see the meaning directly. We don't interpret anything. We don't say, okay, here is a wooden board with a mark on it. How shall I interpret it? No. You and I just see meaning. So there's a rich phenomenological apprehension of what's going on right away. In the seeing is the meaning. You don't have to interpret anything, you just see it. And Wittgenstein says, how come we see it? And as I said, his idea is there's a whole background of culture, practices, non-discursive phenomena, not necessarily propositional phenomena, not necessarily explicit laws, rules, norms, or anything. Social memories, a whole history of culture, practices of various kinds. And all this makes possible our seeing the sign. So the example, in this particular example, I said if we have a background of martial weaponry, where we see arrows being shot with, and the arrow going in a certain direction, when it's shot through a bow, we get a sense of directedness from the image of it going in that direction. So it's things like images and things we remember through a whole cultural background of books, comic books, films, and so on. All that makes possible the immediate, non-interpreted, perceptual apprehension of the meaning and norm. Okay, so having put that in its place, I want to take up a nominous person. So, as I said, somebody from a different culture, which didn't have martial weaponry of bows and arrows, and my example was, if an arrow was just there for decorative purposes, they might not see this. They might have to interpret it and say, what is going on with this on this board? Right? It's only we who've been brought up in a culture where we know of martial weaponry and see the direction of the bow and arrow that we can immediately see this. Somebody who's from a different culture might not. So that's a very important fact about how forms of life, as Wittgenstein put it, or social practices, cultural memories, collective memories of that kind, make possible the apprehension of norms and rules and so on in the foreground, and they make possible science in the foreground. All of this rich background of culture makes possible the logos-oriented knowledges in the foreground. Now, what if somebody in our culture failed to see the arrows as saying turn left? So let me call this person the anomalous member of our group. So one of us says, what is this sign? He doesn't see it immediately. So what is this sign? He somehow fallen through the net. He's not getting it. Okay. So now ask the question, how should we think of this person? He's part of us. He's been brought up in this culture. He's just somehow slipped through the net. He's not getting it. He's standing there scratching his head while we're all turning left. And he's saying, what shall I do? What shall we say about such a person? Now, I think this is a very good way of raising the question about the relationship between individual and society. To consider such an anomalous figure. And one way to respond to this person, there are passages in Wittgenstein where he tends to say this kind of thing, which I think is a disastrous spoiling of his own insight. One way that often people respond to it is to say, well, if there is such a person and he's not getting it, all we can say is, this is how we do it. Just shape up. So you just lay down the law. You say, this is how we do it. That ruins Wittgenstein's insight of it. That is not the relationship between religion and society. When the whole point, the whole brilliant insight of a background making possible apprehension of elements in logos, fully discursive, propositional, normative phenomena, the whole point of that is that you don't come foreground the social. You don't say, this is how we do it. Its work is being done by the background. You don't bring it into the foreground and say, this is the law, this is how we are. You don't do that. That's for the social to tyrannize the individual. I mean, it's a rather rarefied form of tyranny, of course, because I'm talking highly theoretically, I'm not talking about a state or anything like that. I'm just saying, it's nevertheless the wrong way to think of the relationship between society and the individual. To take something which is supposed to be doing its work in the background and foregrounding it and saying, this is how we do it. It's basically, for those of you who are philosophers, taking Plato's heavenly forms and bringing it down to earth and calling it society. But we are not secularized, socialized Platonists. We should not be that kind of Platonist. We should see the role of society as restricted to the background, as an enabler, not as an authority figure in the foreground itself. Okay. Therefore, I think all of Foucault's talk of discipline must be understood as an entirely background phenomenon. Foucault himself does not do that. He doesn't have the background-foreground distinction. So very often amongst all these post-structuralist theorists, there's a tendency to see the notion of a discipline, whether it's a discipline like philosophy or economics or history, it cannot do its work by dictation of norms. Its work is done only in the background. And that's not always how Foucault and Bourdieu and all see it, but nevertheless I think this is how discipline works. Discipline is not authority of any kind. All right. So the relationship between social and individual should not be marred by bringing the social into having a foregrounded role is the point. Okay, I'm now ready to ask the question of today's lecture. How can we use this point that I've been making to, but maybe let me just say one more thing before I raise the question about criticism of literature and art and humanities. One more point. If we don't just thump the table with this is how we do it, when we have such an anomalous person, what else might we do? How could we deal with such a person without the authoritarian bringing forward the social and saying this is how we do it? How can we give a response to this anomalous figure to bring him into our own, as it were, by still sticking with this background social role? And the answer is very simple. We do it by looking somewhere in the background, which is less obvious than the martial weaponry and so on and so forth, and getting the person to see the point still within the background. So, for instance, the example I gave in the written lecture I sent Alok and Kalpana is, you might say, for instance, do you see that boat? Do you see that the boat has a shape of this kind, like an arrow in front, and there's a flat thing at the bottom? And you see that the boat moves forward in the way that the arrow moves forward, where there's a pointed end. And so you see that, therefore, the connection between the image connection, the image similarity between the boat and its direction of movement and the arrow shape, which is the same shape, and the direction of movement. That's the kind of thing you do. You restrict your enabling cultural role in the background by pointing to some other place in the background, which is not the obvious place in the background. That's what it is to stick with the right understanding of the relationship between the social and the individual, that you give that kind of response to the anomalous figure. Okay, now we're ready to ask the question, what has this got to do with the criticism of art and literature? Now, the criticism of art and literature is the richest, some of the richest human activity and angles of our relationship to the world that we possess. I feel impertinent saying something very, very simple and singular about it. I have no desire to simplify or detract from the extraordinary richness of the ways in which we approach art and literature. There are all sorts of ways in which we come to say, a painting or a sculpture or an installation or a poem or an epic. But since my topic is truth, and I'm looking for ways to restore against all the theories I mentioned last time, the place of truth, and say why it's so natural to think of truth as having wide scope, even in these areas of study of society and literature and art and so on. I'm just going to focus on a very specific kind of criticism. Lots of kinds of criticism. I'm going to focus on a very specific kind of criticism, which I believe cannot go away, despite all the other interesting things that go on in art and criticism. So here's my thought. My thought is that one way to think of one sort of thing which is truth-oriented that a literary critic or an art critic does is to see the person she's addressing as the anomalous figure in our society. Writing as if one is addressing the anomalous figure in our society. Okay? And why anomalous? Why should we see literary criticism and art criticism as dealing with anomaly? Well, because literature and art isn't like logos. It isn't got reason. It isn't doing prediction and explanation, etc. So let me come to this by, for instance, asking you to think of the difference between literature and art and illustrative examples through, say, cartoons or pictures or paintings in a psychology or a sociology textbook, or narrative examples in a sociology or psychology textbook. What's going on? You can tell a little story as an example of something in a sociology or psychology textbook. You can draw a picture. You can put a cartoon. Cartoons are often there in sociology and psychology textbooks. What is the difference? What is the difference between those things in sociology and psychology textbooks, which may be identical with something on a museum wall or something in a book of short stories or whatever? What's the difference? The difference is that art and literature aren't presenting you things which has already been figured out somewhere else, in the realm of logos. It's doing its figuring out on its own terms. It's not presenting to you things which are figured out in terms that have already been in the realm of logos. It's not. You're missing what's going on if you think that you figured something out in philosophy, in science, in history, as academic disciplines, and you're going to present that in art. Well, that's not art. You have to do the figuring out in art and literature. The figuring out itself is to be done in art and literature. That's absolutely primitive central point. If you don't get that, you just forget what our topic is. So, if that is so, and you have this anomalous figure who's not getting it, all you can do is go to, in the interstices of the background, which is what the literary critic does, not the obvious places, not the obvious places where the conventional meanings of turn left might be, ordinary interpretations of words might be. You go to the interstices of the background to usher the reader, the critic does that, to usher, in the social background, in the cultural background, in the collective memories, social memories, practices, etc. You go to the interstices to get the reader to see what is there in the work, outlook or literary work. Right? That's the point of the anomalous figure. The anomalous figure is an extremely interesting model, it's hardly the right word, but interesting sort of site for how to think of what criticism does. Looking at the interstices, still in the background, nothing foregrounded, to usher the reader to, and now I want to use a phrase, to usher the reader to what is in the work. That's what I mean by how truth applies. In this aspect of criticism, it ushers the reader to what is there in the work. It's nothing to do with the eye of the beholder and the the subject and so on, it's in the object. By pointing to things in the background, one ushers the reader to see what is in the work. And it's quite right to say that what one ushers the reader to is to see the value in the work. It's just that the notion of value here is not a prescriptive notion in the standard sense. You see, a lot of criticism in art and literature thinks that the role of value is to prescribe. So the worst offenders here, there are very good critics, but the worst offenders here, way back in traditional literature, Alok would know this as a student, were people like T.S. Eliot and F.R. Leavis, who were constantly talking of the great tradition. These are the great artists. So there was always this prescribing. This is great, this is not great, this ranking. Not only do I find it self-important and tedious, I think it's almost comical to read somebody like Leavis in this mode. I mean, Leavis can be extremely insightful in this other mode that I'm trying to bring out. But value is not, well, let's make this artist prominent and let's make this artist demote his. What is that? That's a completely comical way of thinking of the notion of value relevant to art or literature. And Eliot and Leavis did a lot of that, and I think that's to quite misunderstand what the point of value is. So my understanding of finding value in a work is to say that when you find value in the work, the value in the work makes a demand on you. Being a value, it makes a demand on you to experience it as it ought to be experienced. It's not a matter of saying the value of the work is high and some other value is not. The notion of value is there. You disclose through this ushering by pointing to elements in the background, you take the reader to value properties in the work, which, if they are apprehended, make a demand on the reader to experience the work as it ought to be experienced, as the work demands to be experienced. That's what makes it possible to say that what the critic does is say things that are true. That the work contains the very things that the ushering is taking you to, and being a value and normative phenomenon, it makes demands on you. What demands? To experience it as it ought to be experienced. That's the way truth comes in. It's there, it's disclosed, but it's not the sort of thing science studies. It's a value-oriented thing. Being a value, it makes normative demands on you. What demands? Experience me this way. Now, that's one, I'm saying, all sorts of things criticism of. This is one thing it does. And it's where the notion of truth is just non-cancelable element. And if this is right, there are two questions that are sort of objections that might arise in your mind. One is a very general one, but let me start with a specific one, which is more interesting in a way. And see, very often people in aesthetics worry about the subjective element. What I've tried to show is that the notion of truth applies because there's value in the work is disclosed, and the subject only comes in as being demanded to experience what is there in the right way. But there's a great tendency in us to think that so much of the experience that I'm talking about is not object-oriented, demanded by the object, but the experience is a very subjectively felt thing. You can't leave out the phenomenological subjectivity of the experience. And that's what seems to be missing in what I'm saying when I say you've got to experience it as it ought to be experienced, because it's there, the property, in the work. But I don't think that affect, emotion, which is the standard thing, Aristotle talked of pity and fear, everybody talks of affect, emotion. I don't think these things are subjective phenomena in that sense that would spoil what I'm saying. They're not. They are subjective. But I want to say that at their deepest, something like affect is the standard, so I'll use the omnibus term affect or emotion. It's not just in the Western tradition that the whole notion of rasa is absolutely central, the notion of affect and emotion in our own tradition, aesthetic traditions. So I don't believe, and I keep asking my colleague Sheldon Pollock, and he says that there isn't such a thought in our traditions, which I find very credible, but since I'm not a scholar, we're not to quarrel with him. But here's my thought. I don't believe that affect is in any way spoiling the point I'm making. So let me say how I think of something like affect or emotion, to say why. So take something that's simple, much more complicated things, but I'm going to obviously have to keep things simple. Take something like anger. Now, I think that anger, a lot of occurrences of affects like anger, say, are not subjective in a way that spoil what I'm saying. Because it's quite wrong, I think, to think of anger as follows. So suppose one way to think of anger, and I think it's the much more standard way, is to say one believes something. Let's say, I believe that somebody's done me harm. And the belief is all in place. And then my anger wells up. So I have the belief first. It's a belief about the world. Ajay has done me harm. And I come to have that belief, and I have the affect of anger. That's how I see things. I come to have the belief that Heathcliff is a sort of shit, and I come to have an anger welling up. I'm talking about the Wuthering Heights protagonist who is a shit. And so the anger wells up after I come to have the belief. But I don't think anger is for the most part, anger is not like that. I think the belief is not in place first, with the anger then welling up as a product of having that belief. The anger is a way of perceiving that somebody's done me harm. I mean, the anger is in any case mostly simultaneous with the belief. It's not as if the belief, sometimes it does, but I think certainly in the apprehension of literature, art and so on, the affect is something which is a way of perceiving the value properties I've been talking about. My anger is a way of perceiving that someone's done me harm. It's a mode of perception. Think of it like this. My toothache, think of pain. My toothache is, I can perceive my tooth by going to a mirror and unfurling my lip and seeing my tooth. I can perceive my tooth by putting a finger on it and touching it. But I can also perceive my tooth by more internally, more involuntarily, by just paining it. My toothache is an internal, involuntary form of perceiving my tooth, of perceiving the condition of my body. And I think anger is similarly a way of perceiving things in the world, sometimes in the art world, sometimes in an artwork, etc. That's the relationship of affect. It's not something that you get cognitively perceive something and the affect wells up. The affect is a way of perceiving the properties in the artwork or properties in the world, such as that somebody's done me harm. So I don't believe that one should think of affect as in any way an obstacle to the kind of object-oriented, truth-oriented conception of disclosure of properties to be aptly experienced that I'm talking about. Okay, I want to raise another more general objection that is everywhere raised by philosophers, which I find completely unconvincing, but it is so rampant among philosophers that I would feel incomplete without having said something about it. And that is that there is a very widespread view that there are very good reasons to think that the predicate is true only applies to the propositions of natural science, and it doesn't apply to things which are normative, evaluative, and so on and so forth, as I've been trying to argue. Those are very widespread and it's influential, and you can see that it's sort of intuitive, so let me present the most sophisticated form of argument for it, which is by a brilliant philosopher, Bernard Williams, and also by Hilary Putnam, and I want to present it because I think it's very important, partly because it brings out something about the notion of genealogy too. Here's what Bernard Williams gives as an argument for saying that only the propositions of natural science can be said to be true or false. Williams says that there is no other intellectual enterprise. There's no other intellectual enterprise that has the following property. And if you don't have this property, you're not tracking truth. And the property he mentions is that it's only in natural science that there's an accumulation of outcomes or results that converge on something. You know, in literary criticism and philosophy, somebody says something in ancient Greece or in the medieval period, and then somebody else says something else. Somebody comes to revise something that's said in ancient Greece, as the Renaissance did. You know, there are all sorts of, there's no convergence, there's no accumulation building up on results one upon the other. There's no such thing. Only in science there's a result, you have a result, you build on it to get a result that incorporates that and something else, you build on that, you get something else, build on that, and so on. And so there's a convergence. There's a convergence of results and outcomes which accumulates, each one building on the past. There's no such thing in the history of literature, literary criticism, philosophy, social studies. No such thing. You know, somebody had democratic ideas in Greece, abandoned it for years, so on and so forth. And then it was revived through a whole liberal period, and then it's being abandoned by this fascist government. And so you know, it just goes back and forth. So, only in science does it converge. And therefore, only in science can you say that the truth is being tracked. Right? And the posits of science, electrons or whatever, or fields or quarks, they are real things because they are things that you accumulate in a convergence. So truth, reference, all these emerge only because of this property of convergence. Okay, now I can see on some of you faces that you're actually finding this plausible. Well, shame on you. It's an absolutely terrible argument. And the reason why it's terrible you can approach it by asking, when did this convergence start? When did this convergence start? Did it start from the beginning of human thought? Have we been converging ever since we began to think as a species? That's absurd. There have been innumerable false starts, false leads, phlogiston. I mean, any number of so we started with all sorts of false leads. When did, for centuries. And Williams and Putnam and all these people who make this argument will be the first to say, yes, this convergence began sometime in the 17th century, the rise of modern science, and that's when it began. Didn't start from the beginning of thought. Started sometime in the 17th century. They themselves say that. Okay, well, what is it to say it started as late as that? What makes it start there? And the only answer is that sometime in the 17th century, we got onto the right path. And then the convergence began. So sometime here, we got onto the right path. And then the right path is the path of convergence. Okay, so what is the word right doing there? What is this right? What makes the path the right path? What is this word right? Williams is assuming the notion of truth to give an argument for why truth is applicable in this convergence. He's taking for granted what he's supposed to be proving. He's using the very notion he's supposed to be establishing through the notion of convergence. He's presupposed it. How on earth is it an argument to prove something when you've presupposed it in your argument? Truth is not something that truth is sui generis. It's a natural way of talking. All that truth means is there's a gap between something you think and what is the case. Sometimes you get sometimes what you think gets what is the case, sometimes it doesn't. That's the notion of truth. It's a totally irreducible notion, can't be the product of any argument. It's sui generis, it's completely on its own. You're not going to get it through any argument of any kind. I hope the argument that I'm giving, the counter-argument I'm giving is clear. By using the word right, he's presupposing whatever it is he's supposed to establish as a result of the notion of convergence. You can't presuppose something you're supposed to be proving. Okay, now, I had promised somebody who spoke yesterday that I would hold my nose and speak about the issue of relativism and multiple truths. It's on everybody's mind. Every one of you listening to this has said, what's he talking about? There's so many truths, there's so many different social cultures, societies and cultures, and each one of them will see something differently and outwork differently. So what happens when there's so much multiplicity of truth? Now, I didn't know, I didn't want to hog this. I'm very keen to hear Alok and Kalpana, and I'm happy to take this up in the discussion. It's such an annoying topic, and so familiar, and I'm so tired of it. But if everybody's saying, how can you give 2 lectures on the topic without addressing it? Do I have time? You give them their full time and so on. We have what then? All right. So I'm going to take up a question of what it is that, what happens to this so-called, insistence on my part that it's very natural to think of truth as having the wide scope it does in notions of social ideas of freedom and so on, as well as in these humanistic areas. Well, what do you do with the fact that there are many truths? That is, if the backgrounds are very different, as I myself said, if you don't belong to a culture, a social background where there's martial weaponry, you might not see something as meaning or truth, or which others will see, and so on. So there's no getting away from this multiplicity, or which sometimes leads people to embrace the doctrine of relativism about truth. Well, the shallow way of raising it, of course, is to say, well, people can see different things being demanded by a literary work or an artwork, so on. And I think that's shallow, because if there's no conflict between the different ways of reading it, then they're both true. So if there's no conflict between different perceptions, they're both true. So I never understood why the so-called incommensurability in its standard mode is supposed to be a problem. Incommensurability is that you have different, completely different sort of angles on something, and that's supposed to put the notion of truth in doubt. But why should completely different angles on things put the notion of truth in doubt? If you say mountains are big, and I say books are interesting, these are completely different, incommensurate claims. So what's the problem for truth? They're both true. They're incommensurate, but they're both true. So how does it raise a problem for truth? Books are interesting, mountains are big. They're incommensurate claims, they're totally have nothing to do with each other, they're disparate, so it can't just be a problem for truth that there's this kind of incommensurateness. So what we have a problem only when there is a conflict, and any effort of how to perceive a work, or how to make a claim about society or whatever, that there are different ways of perceiving it, they conflict, and there's no possible discussion of how to resolve the conflict. There's no conflict in that example of books and mountains, but when there is a conflict, and there's no way to come to common grounds for resolving the conflict, that you get what might be a problem for the notion of truth. What might be a problem for the notion of truth. All right, so in some of my early work, when I wrote about Islam and Muslim identity, and in the aftermath of Rushdie's book, I'd argued that when this happens, when there's a conflict, so there was a conflict between liberal Enlightenment ideas of Europe and the West, and many of those who wanted to ban the book, assassinate the author, and so on. And it didn't seem as if this, so the conflict was there. One side wanted to ban the book, one side was thumping the table with free speech. So there was a conflict, and there didn't seem any resolution because each point of view, as it were, was enclosed in its own set of commitments that weren't speaking to each other. So there was no give between the two. Now this might lead one to say, well, if I'm in this point of view, I simply have to, the truth is relative to my point of view, and your truth is relative to your point. You would say that of your truth. I don't think you can say that. First of all, this is not a, I don't want to rest with this point, but I don't think you can say the truth is relative to my point of view, because you can only say that if you've stepped out of your point of view. And where have you gone if you've stepped out of your point of view? That is, if you say the truth is relative to my point of view, you must be in a position which is outside of your point of view and saying the truth is relative to it. Well, where are you standing? You can't have it both ways. You can't say your perceptions of truth are within a culture and so on, and say that you're a relativist, because to say that a relativist means you're not within your culture. You're standing somewhere in Mars, or wherever, some transcendental Archimedean point, and there is no Archimedean point. That's what we already established in our talk of Hegel regards Kant last time. So you can't, relativism is not a stateable doctrine. By your own lights you can't state it. You see, the great thing about what Hegel pointed out is, it undermines both Kant's universalism and this relativism. If there's no Archimedean point, neither doctrine is stateable. Okay, so that's the very general thing to say about relativism. But still, somebody might say the substance of the issue can be, it's something you must wrestle with, despite not wanting to hang it on the peg of a doctrine or an ism, like relativism. There's still an issue here. There's a conflict, and there's something to resolve, because there seems to be an impasse in the conflict, because there's no common ground and no common criteria. So in my work, I had said that there's no answer to such conflict and impasse unless one finds contradictions, unless one point of view finds contradictions or tensions within the other point of view and seeks to unsettle the other point of view on the matter of disagreement. Right? So the idea is you have 2 points of view, and they're disagreed on this proposition, P and not P, and the book, free speech or whatever. And if both sides are completely consistent points of view, they're completely consistent points of view and coherent points of view, there are no tensions or contradictions either side, then you're stuck. Right? If there are tensions and contradictions in either side, then the other side can say, see, you believe this, but it's in tension with something else you believe, etc., and so you can use it. But if both sides are coherent and consistent completely, and one believes P and the other believes not P, there's what you might think is going to be a case of the substance of relativism, even if you can't say it. Well, you're not monsters of consistency and coherence. Rational automata might be like that, but we're human beings. We're not monsters of coherence. There are tensions in our thinking all the time. But someone might say, yeah, there are tensions, but they're not tensions that speak to the disagreement between P and not P. So we grant you that we're not monsters of coherence. and consistency, but there are no contradictions, tensions that address the disagreement over P and not P. Is that what people think is the real difficulty for truth? That you've got inconsistency, you've got conflict about what is true. Well, I think what's very interesting here is to invoke Hegel once again, because what Hegel points out is that subjects, such as those who disagree there, are always in history. Subjects are not consciousness, Geist, if Hegel is right, are not just subjects to be synchronically conceived, like snapshots in time. Subjects are in history. So for him, Geist or consciousness, or what you and I would call subjects with beliefs and points of view of that kind, are always in history. So I'm going to represent Hegel here. We have a concept, subject dash in dash history. That's an unbreakable predicate. It's an unbreakable term. You can't remove the hyphens. You can't remove the hyphens. It's a complex notion, subject in history. Right? That's Hegel's point. And when you have that, Hegel's point is tensions and contradictions may always arise as a result of being in history, because history may introduce contradictions and tensions. That's Hegel's one great contribution to the development of philosophy, to Kant in particular, which was a much more stationary understanding of synchronic understanding. So it would be to miss the depth of Hegel to say, well, what you're saying is there's relativism now. You've got to admit there's relativism now. Maybe sometime in the future it'll get resolved. No, that's to see the subject at time t1, the subject at time t2, the subject at time tn. That's not what Hegel is saying. There is no subject in categorized slabs of time like t1, t2, tn. The subject in history is an open-ended subject. That would be to remove the hyphens and say subject time t1, so no. It's subject in history is an open-ended subject. It's not a subject synchronically at one, a different subject synchronically at two. The subject is always subject in history. And if it is so, then contradictions, if the subject is necessarily in history, then it's always possible that contradictions will emerge and you will be able to engage with each other sufficiently. So engagement is something that between two people, rather than just sticking with an impasse of disengaged, live and let live, etc., is not an option for Hegel. It's just, if you see the subject in history, engagement and the overcoming of an impasse of this kind is always possible. So if one is, now there are other thinkers, philosophers like Bourdieu and so on, whose understanding of the notion of the social is different, and even the historical is different. They tend to think, Foucault too, tends to think that the evidence in history is that it's much more pessimistic. So the way, the dispute between Hegel, whose ideas I'm endorsing here to counter the allegedly relativistic impasse on truth, by saying that history might always introduce tensions and resolve these conflicts through engagement, of giving this internal reasoning to the other through the contradictions, pressing on the contradictions. I think the difference between Hegel's position and others like Bourdieu and Foucault is a difference and disagreement on two iterated modalities. Now this sounds more complicated than it is, but it's perfectly straightforward. What Hegel is saying is that if you see the subject in history, it is necessary, if the subject is necessarily in history, it's not a snapshot, synchronic subject, the subject is necessarily in history, it is necessary that it is possible that conflicts and tensions will emerge in a Geist, in the consciousness, in the subject, and the other point of view can press on that contradiction and change its mind. So the iterated modality for Hegelians is it is necessary that it is possible that contradictions will emerge. I think Foucault and Bourdieu have a more pessimistic view of history. It's a very pessimistic view. So at most history shows that it is possible, that it's possible that these conflicts will emerge. And so if the iterated modality you're committed to is it's necessary that it's possible, it's much less prone to so-called relativism than if your view is that it's possible that it's possible. Now maybe there's no result. This is a very rarefied theoretical dispute over iterated modalities, which is the more plausible iterated modality. It's necessary that it's possible, or it's possible that it's possible. Maybe my view that it's necessary that it's possible, which is an anti-relativistic instinct in support of that modality, is a matter of just taking an ethical stance, because I think engaging with the other is a more ethical position. Maybe it's not a predictive stance in history, but it's a normative commitment that you should see things from the point of view of engagement. So this would be a highly philosophical way of redeeming Gramsci's adage, pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. Thanks very much.
Kalpana ji first.
Good evening, friends. I'd like to begin by thanking Professor Akeel Bilgrami and Mr. Ashok Vajpayee for this invitation. I found the lectures which we received ahead
I forgot my hearing aid, so I wanted to
very, very instructive and educative, particularly because it spoke to the questions that I've been grappling with in my work at the intersection of law and sociology, and not quite been able to crack. And somehow, reading the first lecture, which I received quite a while ago, alongside Akeel's recent book on capital culture and the commons, seemed to open up possibilities and ideas that I could productively explore in terms of the ways in which we understand the law and the constitution working on the ground. And then I was really pleasantly surprised to receive the second lecture, which is actually very closely connected to the book. So it seemed like the interstices had been illuminated in a manner of speaking. I can't, of course, I mean, there are several points in both the lectures, although I was meant to comment on one. I find them both very connected. And there are too many points in both that I could explore, but I picked about 5 or 6, and I will just go over them quickly. But I must say that these are actually the thoughts that got triggered for me while I was reading the lectures. And so it's like, in a sense, my response that may not be directly connected to or taking the points that the arguments that Akeel makes in his lecture, but to see where that takes me in terms of my work. The first point that I looked at was on the reach of truth and obstacles that have been placed in its path. In probing this, I reached back to the book, Capital, Culture and the Commons, and found that it helped me better understand what is evidently, apologies for the legalese, evidently a conceptual blank. And I reached back to this work because the first lecture, like I said, leads in that direction, and the second draws quite substantively from the concerns in the book and takes it forward. At a more basic level, though, the book helps me reflect on both the lectures better. The context I embed my comment in is the commons. What Nityanand Jayaraman, for instance, speaks of as Porabogan in Tamil, spoken of at the moment of its diminishment, as Akeel alerts us, and its weaponized enclosure. We may think of the habitations of truth, the paths to reach which are in fact obstructed by moral, political and aesthetic judgments about human behavior and society that construct a narrow politics that channel our journey, putting truth out of reach and making reaching impossible through the thickets of reasoning and making its reach stop there, which are questions that Akeel reflects on in quite great detail. As someone who is ever preoccupied with the everydayness of the Constitution, not its spectacular movements, not its spectacular moments, which are also in a sense part of its everydayness and continuous and contiguous with it. The problems that beset reaching truth and the reach of truth are striking. I tend to think of this in terms of cases and judgments, pardon me, or judgments that ought to have been, absent judgments, shall we say. These are the everyday ones, and the recent acquittal of the accused in a case of lynching, the continuing incarcerations of political dissenters and their entrapment in the talons of opaque anti-terror laws, the truths in prison diaries of dissenters are truths that circulate within prisons. Procedure, juridical for instance, remains impervious to truth-telling in deeply agonizing ways. The diaries tell us about what we know, but keep locked up about the ordinariness of carcerality, and carcerality is another trope that Akeel explores. The ordinariness of carcerality in our judgments about people and society. But also in the very act of telling, the dissenters who are incarcerated are harking to ways in which this ordinariness does not draw from the background that we know of a collectivity as a collectivity that gave to themselves a constitution. The specific point I begin with is the relationship, therefore, between the background or the non-discursive and the implicit and the foreground or the discursive and the explicit, if we treat the constitution as a commons, a shared commons that bind a group as a group in its own self-conception, and I'm quoting him, then what are the ways in which the non-explicit, non-discursive traditions of fellowship speak to the discursive formations in the foreground? In invoking the commons, we are speaking of its philosophical genealogies and its fundamental premises, grounded in the complex interplay of sharing, sustenance, and I would add fellowship, that remain for the most part inarticulate and unself-conscious in the lived contexts of the everyday. Unself-conscious become explicit and non-discursive. Ideally, the foreground should draw from and express the spirit of the background, of the constitution as commons. And we do not really register, as Akeel alerts us, we do not register the ideal as long as it is working. Why are we distressed today by judicial pronouncements that erect weaponized enclosures around what we understand and know as the commons? The fact of that collective gasp of disbelief and dismay harks perhaps to the reach of truth that is embedded in the idea of what I like to believe is the Constitution as a commons. The second point that I look at is on the relations between, on the relations that truth bears to freedom or self-rule and autonomy. This is brought to the fore quite literally at the end of the point I just made. Is incarceration a metaphor for the fencing in of truth? We may take this further, as Akeel suggests, and I quote, to see Swaraj as synonymous with autonomy and conjoin the notion of freedom with self-rule. He argues that it is precisely this conjunction that makes an entire dominant liberal tradition of the political enlightenment anxious, unquote. But we witness this anxiety and moral panic in real time as Swaraj conjoined with Azadi, which is the word for Swaraj that we have heard ring through cities in this country since 2019, in the context of the citizenship question and political dissent, drives a fierce carcerality to hold truth in captivity. I'm reminded here of the question, for instance, that Mr. Habibullah asked yesterday about the Western Indian distinctions, about the Western, non-Western distinctions in argumentation, of which a little more later. And then the relationship between Swaraj and Satya, which is yet another point that Akeel elaborates on. We can gain independence from a colonial master and still be enslaved, both cognitively and in one's cultural and social life. We find different iterations of this in the oceanic works of anti-caste philosophers, and in the voices of women who challenge the thraldom of caste and patriarchal oppression and violence. Ratmabai and Tarabai Shinde come to mind immediately for me, and they bring in the element of freedom and the domestic, the deep truths of servitude and unfreedom. I'm also struck by the possibility of connecting Swaraj and Satya to Dukkha. Ankit Kavade's short, compelling piece on Mukta Salve and her use of dukkha, which excavates the truth of suffering as distinct and separate from grief, as a deep, searing longing for Swaraj that emerges from the emancipatory anti-caste intellectual traditions, is important. My point is that Swaraj is a many-splendored pursuit of truth. The truth itself reaches out in so many different ways to conjoin with the idea of freedom and self-rule, breaking free from our nature cultures. We're talking about the commons, to ask, after Akeel, does one have reason to do what one's inclinations would have them do? Ought we to acquiesce to our inclination and continue to live in the blissful, opiate lull of heteronomy? The autonomy reflecting question that is ever present, as Akeel suggests, whether asked or not, by virtue of our capacity to ask it, more specifically to address ourselves not just to any norm, but the moral norm or the goodwill, or a universal norm. And the emphasis on reason and the ought is not so much on individual self-interest as it is on the group and the individual situated in the group. And this really bears reiteration. Akeel says it is the truth that sets us free. And if we get things wrong, we lack autonomy, despite having chosen and authorized what we did. How would one apply this to the reasoning of courts in particular cases? Take the case of Sharjeel Imam and Omar Khaled. The courtly decisions here force us to raise the question of the relationship between autonomy, truth, and azadi, between satya and dukkha, which at this point signals both suffering and grief at the caging or enclosure of the truth. Where it remains free is in the Constitution as commons that must then reinvent the foreground. And I will come back to that at the end. On transparency, opacity, and the veridical perception of the truth. If there is no other way in which the truth can be disclosed, and I'm quoting, no transcendent path to it, the conceptual default must be transparency. When there is opacity in some cases, then explanation is called for, and a warning that we should be more alert and vigilant, and reflectively vigilant than we have been, unquote. The importance of veridical perception is brought home to us, for instance, through the opacity of carceral judgments, where the positing of conjectural likeness creates a dissonance in the perception of truth, utterly lacking as it does in transparency. This is, of course, to oversimplify the case Akeel is making, but the comparison struck me as stark. For it is, after all, transparency that we claim in interpreting rights under the Constitution, particularly the right to personal liberty in the present time. And personal liberty here acquires layers of meaning in the course of our subcontinental and vernacular engagements. To what conceptualization of law in the background must we have to enable a renewal of its implementation in the foreground? Where the foreground cancels the basic precepts that structure the background, how might one recover a different enunciation of the foreground that the background enables? It is a basic question of citizenship and survival, and the affirmation of dignity. 2 days ago, I was at the Rohit Vemula Shahadat Din gathering, marking 10 years of his passing in the University of Hyderabad, with 2 mothers and 1 father, deeply grieving the loss of their children to the violence of caste in institutions of higher education, stood and spoke to a gathering of largely Dalit students on the need to stand their ground to defeat caste, to never give up. It is a scene etched in my mind. 2 questions occurred to me. What is the place of emancipation? All over again. What is the place of emancipation in the argument that freedom or swaraj is underwritten by dignity, which is the deep longing that dukkha laments? How does one perceive the frame of anti-caste in the background and articulate it in the foreground? both all the way from the cultural commons that Akeel speaks of to the more specific constitution as commons. Might this be an illustration of his observation that truth is truth, not local truth, not truth related to a practice, even if we can only apprehend the truth because of the background of our own practices, forms of life, unquote. And of course, it also leads us back to Mr. Habibullah's question yesterday. In thinking through the idea of the Constitution as commons and working around the ways in which we might delineate the frames, which is a term that Akeel uses in the last part of his book, delineate the frames and the conversations and the relationality between frames and between the implicit and the explicit that he opens out. There are so many pathways to understanding this in all its complexity and its utter simplicity. In that book and in a previous one as well, Akeel tells a father's story that I have read many times over and really liked. I have a father's story and was wondering how it might be illuminated by or might illuminate Akeel's story of his beach walk with his father. The idea, his father's story, the idea that nobody will pick up a wallet full of money lying on the beach if we don't pick it up, as pointing to a belief in a fellowship of human beings who breathe this air of truth. My father's reply to a judge in the 1970s who wanted to know why he was seeking constitutional protection for people who did not believe in the Constitution, in this case the Naxalites, the radical left, that boycotted bourgeois courts in the early 70s. The judge asks, why should Naxalites who do not believe in the Constitution take shelter under it? My father says, I replied, when such issues come before the court, it is your values and not their values that are on trial. It is the values enshrined in the Constitution that are under test. The your and their, it struck me, seemed to reflect not the codified Constitution, but the non-discursive Constitution as originary values, perhaps, that my father was alluding to. This thought, I have read this story many, many times, and I have heard him recount this story to me even more number of times. But this possibility never occurred to me. This thought occurred to me quite unexpectedly, that there is perhaps in his grappling with the Constitution, the idea of a non-discursive, originary framework of the Constitution as commons, that then results in the foreground of codified, implementable, justiciable rights. In conclusion, in these lectures and in his work on the commons, Akeel presents profound possibilities. How, for instance, does one probe the possibility that mentality itself is not compulsory? And again, we have Ambedkar's argument on the need for notional change in order for the annihilation of caste to happen. The simple fact that there are different pools of memory that we may draw from to recover conceptual resources that we fear we have lost, and this is part of what Akeel is saying, and what he referred to, the anomaly and illuminating usher, he calls it, located in the interstices of the background of our traditions and practices, that discloses that there is something there to get right. And the possibility of the anomaly, it strikes me, is a gift of hope. Thank you.